Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream History podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor DLC Allison Jr. Today's discussion will be based on his book titled Constructing Jesus, Memory, Imagination, and History. So welcome back to History podcast, Dale.
Happy to be here.
Thank you for joining me. When you called your book Constructing Jesus, what do you mean by that? Like how different authors of the New Testament constructed Jesus, or how other people constructed Jesus, or both? Could you tell us?
Yeah, I don't have a philosophical issue here that I'm promoting. So constructivism is a big term now in the humanities and philosophy, and I'm not a radical constructionist, but I do think that we have to take the Gospels and use them as sources. So just as Matthew created an image of Jesus and John created an image of Jesus, this book is contributing towards a particular image of Jesus. So it's my construction, if you will, and it's also an attempt to talk about maybe the best method, or one decent method, or one improved method for going about how we make decisions about Jesus. The context for this is, of course, the so-called quest for the historical Jesus, which has been going on for a very long time now, and scholars disagree with their reconstructions of Jesus. And this is my own attempt to present a particular approach, particular method, and then to show some of the results that it has. But there's nothing profound in the word constructing.
What are what you call the memories of Jesus?
What are the memories of Jesus? Oh my, well, maybe the best way to answer that is to differentiate my own approach from that of many other scholars. The approach that I was taught when I was in graduate school way back in the day, several decades ago, was that of sort of deconstructing the text, making it into little bits, dissolving it into little bits, and then trying through so-called criteria of authenticity to authenticate this bit or that bit. That is, scholars spent a lot of time trying to authenticate this saying of Jesus, or to authenticate that saying of Jesus. And when they authenticated it, they meant that it held memory of him. I practiced that method for a couple of decades, and then I became disillusioned with it for multiple reasons. And what I decided to do at that point was look at how human memory really works. It's very good at getting the gist of things, but it's often not so good at getting the details. In any case, that through a series of steps led me to suggest that maybe a better approach would not be to start with the little pieces that you've taken out of the Gospels, but rather to start with the Gospels as a whole, which means the tradition as a whole, and to look at the themes and motifs, the sorts of things that occur again and again and again in different sources, maybe in different forms, like a parable or a story. And the argument then is that we should start from repeating patterns. So, for example, there are quite a few texts in which Jesus is an exorcist, and there are also texts in which Jesus talks about exorcism. There are enough of these, I think, to infer that if Jesus wasn't an exorcist, this tradition is probably so bad that it doesn't have memory at all. But I think you can, looking at the whole, infer that Jesus was an exorcist, and even say some things about his exorcistic ministry. So for me, this is a sort of common sense approach, and I think it makes a lot more sense than the approach that I was taught when I was in graduate school. So maybe that gets at this issue of memory and what I'm looking at. I'm looking for the gist of things. I'm looking for certain patterns and finding memory in the patterns in the things that are repeated.
Can you tell us about the eschatology of Jesus? And my second question to that is, what are the problems in reconstructing Schweitzer's Jesus? What are these contradictions that emerge supposedly from it?
Well, so first of all, I'm a great admirer of Schweitzer, both as a person and as a scholar. And I consider myself to be in his camp. But Schweitzer, I think, knew too much about Jesus's psychology. And I also think, more importantly, that he was one-sided in his interpretation of Jesus. So for Schweitzer, Jesus held what he called consistent or thoroughgoing eschatology. And he tries to almost reduce everything in the tradition to eschatology. So Jesus had an imminent expectation. He thought the resurrection in the last judgment were to hand, and everything needs to be understood or interpreted in that way. My own view is that Jesus was more like the Jesus of the Gospel of Matthew. And what that means is there is a lot of eschatological expectation in Matthew, but there are many other things too. And there are some things that aren't obviously related to eschatology. It's not that Jesus was a sort of systematic thinker and had simply one thought and everything derived from that. Rather, Jesus was a complex person interested in various things, who spoke to various topics and so on. So eschatology is a very important part of what he is all about. But it's not the only thing that he's all about. So I would differentiate myself from Schweitzer on that point. But I would agree with Schweitzer that Jesus, for the most part, had a hope that things would wrap up soon. And his scenario was a Jewish scenario. It involved the tribulation of the latter days, the resurrection of the dead, the judgment, something like heaven and hell, and also in the midst of that, the coming of one like a son of man, which I think he identified himself with. So a lot of eschatology, but it's not the key to everything. And Schweitzer, I think, was one-sided on that.
And so in other words, do you think that Jesus was an apocalyptic individual? If so, how apocalyptic was he, etc.?
How apocalyptic was he? Well, I think it was fairly apocalyptic. I think this hope is very important to him. I think this hope, for example, lies within the Beatitudes. People are blessed because, not because the world is going to change soon because of what people do, but because God is going to remake the world. So Jesus's eschatology is in part a theodicy. It's an attempt to wrestle with the goodness of God in the light of all the problems in the world and so on. So I think that there's a lot of eschatology there. I don't know exactly how to answer how apocalyptic he was. He hoped for the resurrection of the dead. He believed in the last judgment. He believed in some sort of Gehenna, which we end up calling hell. There is a world to come, heaven on earth, something like that. And these things are an important part of what he is talking about. But I don't think there has been anybody anywhere ever, no matter what their religion or time and place, that was simply about eschatology. You can't just talk about one thing and have a religious movement. You have to appeal to people in multiple ways. and you have to address multiple issues and concerns for people. So maybe I'm evading your question. I don't know how to answer it in terms of like he was a 75% apocalyptic prophet or a 80% or 60%. I don't know. I would just say that this is a very important part of what he was about, and it's not marginal to his ministry, and it is not marginal in the Gospels.
Did his followers believe him to be the Son of Man, or did they think that he was separate from the Son of Man?
I personally think the arguments here are very complex, but I personally think that from the beginning he was identified with the Son of Man. Now, there are different scholarly views, and they are difficult to sort through, and there continue to be books and differences of opinion. And of course, there's the whole question of what the Aramaic, the Son of Man, meant. My own view is that Jesus, from the beginning, paid attention to the vision of Daniel 7 and to the one like a Son of Man, and probably saw himself and maybe himself and his followers represented by this figure. I see no really good reason to think that Jesus paid no attention to Daniel 7 and that his followers, all on their own, without any encouragement from him, turned to Daniel 7 after they had believed that he had risen from the dead. I also don't think the evidence is sufficient to have the thought some people have that originally Jesus spoke of the Son of Man as somebody other than himself, and then later his disciples identified Jesus with that other figure. But having said that, these issues are really complicated, and the position I just took, I would personally want to qualify in multiple ways, but I'm not going to do that here today.
Can you talk about the stages of Q and how that might sort of guide the understanding of a historical Jesus?
Well, so first of all, there's a huge debate today, more so than there was 50 years ago, I think it's fair to say, as to whether there was such a thing as Q, that is, whether there was a sayings source that both Matthew and Luke independently used. I think the arguments for that are still really strong. I wouldn't bet my soul on it, but I would bet a fair hunk of change on this. Now, once you decide that Matthew and Luke are using or were using a common saying source, then you have to reconstruct it. And of course, that's very hypothetical. But attempts have been made. There's actually an international group that's been working on a reconstruction of Q for maybe we're in our third decade of working on that. Anyway, there are different reconstructions of Q. Back in the day, I did my own reconstruction. Now, once you have a reconstruction of Q, which again is hypothetical, it's a posit, it's not a text that we have, you can ask, well, does it look like it's gone through stages? Does it look like the book of Isaiah, where most of the experts say, yeah, there's an Isaiah 1, an Isaiah 2, and Isaiah 3, and the book grew over time. The most, I think, influential analysis of this comes from a Canadian scholar, John Kloppenborg, very bright guy, who thinks that he can see 3 stages in the book of Q. And the first is a wisdom stage. The second is an eschatological stage where eschatological and apocalyptic sayings are added. And the third stage has the addition of the temptation story. I'm not on board with his analysis. I think there are some issues with it. But people who have agreed with him, some of them have gone on to say, well, this argues for the view that Jesus was not an apocalyptic or eschatological prophet, because the earliest part of Q it's wisdom sayings, and then the apocalyptic stuff gets added in a secondary stage. Kloppenborg himself doesn't argue this. He sees no reason to think that the second stage can't also represent Jesus and contribute sayings, authentic sayings from the tradition. Now, as I said, I'm not a big supporter of Kloppenborg's analysis because I have my own, but I have to be honest and say not many people have followed me in my analysis of Q. So Kloppenborg's does have implications for some people, but again, not for Kloppenborg. I have a separate analysis of the history. It's very speculative and very hypothetical, but it does not start with a sort of wisdom basis and then see eschatological or apocalyptic sayings added on. In my analysis, those are there from the beginning. So I think that's an outline of an answer to your question.
Are there parallels between Q, I guess the earliest stage of Q, and with First Thessalonians? Because you talk about First Thessalonians being the earliest Christian writing we have, and it seems to be apocalyptic in certain cases. So are there parallels or thematic parallels at all with Q?
Well, if you're going to follow Kloppenborg's analysis of the tradition, then not much between First Thessalonians and Q1. But if you're just looking at Q, if you think Q existed and you're not, being speculative about the stages through which it grew, then yes, because if you look at First Thessalonians 4 and 5, Paul is talking about the parousia, the coming of Jesus, the second coming, and he's using language from Daniel 7. So it envisages Jesus as the figure from Daniel 7 coming on the clouds of heaven. And if you look at Q also has this Son of Man language, and sometimes the Son of Man language is about the present Son of Man, but some of it is eschatological and refers to the future. So certainly there is overlap at that point, and it supports, I think, my own view of an eschatological or even apocalyptic Jesus.
Can you talk about the fulfillment of biblical oracles?
You'll have to clarify that. What's the question in there?
Sure. In regard to Jesus, when they think that he is fulfilling biblical prophecy, and is there any correlation at all between that and his eschatology?
Oh, well, yes, because they are the same thing. So in Jewish thought, I think it's fair to say, there was this tendency to say, well, we have all these prophecies from Isaiah and Jeremiah and so on, and they are going to be fulfilled in the end of days. They haven't been fulfilled yet. There are marvelous depictions, for example, in Isaiah of a transformed world, and that hasn't come to pass yet. So there was this strong sense, which you can see in many of the pseudepigrapha and many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that these prophecies back there in these sacred texts, in these scriptures, they will be fulfilled in the future. And what you see in the Gospels and in early Christianity in general, in Paul and in Acts, is this sense that, or this conviction that, these eschatological prophecies, these end of time, end of day prophecies, are beginning to be fulfilled. I think myself that goes back to Jesus, and that Jesus was looking, for example, at Isaiah 61 and saying, yes, this is starting to be fulfilled. This is becoming a reality. And the same thing with other prophetic texts. So when he says that if I cast out demons by the finger of God, the kingdom of God has come upon you, within a Jewish context, the coming of the kingdom of God requires that you are fulfilling oracles, that you are fulfilling prophecies. So this idea of the fulfillment of prophecy goes back, in my judgment, to the eschatological Jesus, and then it's picked up and elaborated further, obviously, by the early Christians.
Can you tell us a bit about the possibility of purely metaphorical narratives?
Oh, well, there you're referring to the last chapter. So there are a number of scholars today who look at the Gospels and say that they contain Haggadic elements, that is, legendary or mythological elements. And this is the important part of the recent discussion. The evangelists and some of their early readers, especially Jewish readers, understood that these narratives were not meant to be taken historically. So when Jesus uttered a parable, people didn't ask, is that history? A sower went out to sow. What sower? Where was he? And what year did he live? They understood that the parables were stories. They were illustrative. Now, the question becomes, are there any stories in the Gospels, Peter walking in the water, for example, or Jesus walking on the water, that were intended from the beginning to be metaphorical or symbolic? And everybody knew this is not history, this is just a story. One of the texts that has been much discussed in this connection has been Matthew 27:51 through 53. This is the text which says that when Jesus died, the rocks were rent, there was an earthquake, tombs opened, and the holy ones got up and they walked into Jerusalem. So Jesus in Matthew isn't the only one to rise from the dead. The holy ones, or the saints, whoever exactly they are, also rise from the dead. Now, almost nobody today looks at this and says this is history. So the question becomes, does Matthew think this is historical, in which case he's passing on a legend, but doesn't know it's a legend or doesn't think it's a legend? Or is he sophisticated, like it appears some of the rabbis were, who could tell tall tales, and people who were hearing these tall tales understood that they were like parables, they were metaphorical stories. This is a very interesting proposition. I am, however, on the skeptical side of it. For example, with Matthew 27:51 through 53, I see no narrative hints, none, that this is different from the surrounding narrative. In fact, there's a little note put in by Matthew or somebody, which says this happened after Jesus's resurrection. Somebody's worried about the chronology here. I think that's really odd if it's just a metaphor or a story. But again, there are people, scholars, serious, well-informed scholars, who think that there are texts in the Gospels that were understood when they were first composed or first spoken to be non-literal, non-historical, metaphorical. Now, there's the position I'm taking here is a bit tricky, because I will agree sometimes with those who take a metaphorical approach, that a particular story is probably not historical. But I think that the authors of the Gospels probably thought that they were. So that's where I stand on that issue.
Can you tell us about the issue with, well, actually, I'm going to ask this in two parts. First, what is the hypothetical pre-Pauline, pre-market narrative? And second, what is the problem with the claim that Paul knew this pre-Markan narrative?
Well, German scholars, German form critics, have written a lot about this particular subject, and they have thought on literary grounds that Mark's gospel probably incorporates a pre-Markan narrative. And there are tensions in the narrative that make them think this. Also, the Passion narrative is very different than the rest of the Gospel of Mark, which just sort of goes from story to story, and there's not much connected except for maybe the day in Capernaum in chapter 1. But this is an extended narrative where one event leads to another, and where certain events just don't make any sense, like Peter's denial without a surrounding narrative. It's also very interesting that while Matthew and Luke move Mark or pieces from Mark all around, assuming that they are using Mark, when they get to the Passion narrative, they pretty much get in line. This is also the case with John's gospel. It doesn't have so much in common with the other gospels. Most of the material, half of it, I guess, that it has in common with the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is in the Passion narrative, and the order of events is the same. So for these and other reasons, many scholars have hypothesized that there was an early pre-Markan Passion narrative. In the book, what I have done, I hope it's a contribution to the discussion, is say, let's set Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John aside, and we'll just look at Paul. And what does Paul know about the death of Jesus or the end of Jesus? And what can we infer from Paul about the end and death of Jesus? And I try to show in the book that we can infer several things, and that in fact, everything that appears in Paul about the death of Jesus, or is implied about his end, agrees with, coincides with what you find in Mark's Passion narrative. In addition to that, when Paul relates the story of the Last Supper, he introduces it with, in the night he was betrayed, and then just goes on. In the night he was betrayed shows you that Paul knows the context of this, that it had a context. It took place at night, and there was a betrayer, or Jesus was somehow handed over. So that implies, I think, that Paul doesn't know just these words, he knows a context. And so that fits with what we otherwise know. I think the best hypothesis is that there was some sort of pre-Markan Passion narrative. I think Paul already knows something, some kind of Passion narrative. And if I had to guess, I'd say there was one already circulating in the 40s of the first century, that is probably within 10, 15, 20 years of Jesus's death. And this makes sense to me because Jesus was crucified, which is an offensive thing. It's a stumbling block, as Paul himself says, and their apologetics and their self-understanding would have required that they figure out what the heck this is about. How does this fit? How does this make any sense to us? And some sort of narrative about the end could do that for them. So that gives you some sense of what I think lies behind the text.
Do you think that the pre-Markan narrative existed?
Do you mean existed as a written text? Because I've just made the argument that yes, there is such a text.
Written text or oral text.
I have no idea whether it was written or oral. I'm not sure that it makes any difference. Arguing that it's written, I don't know what the basis for that would be, but I also don't know how you could prove or establish that it was oral. So all I know that what I think for good reason, is that there was a liturgical tradition. I think that liturgical tradition could have circulated orally, could have been known orally, but I also think that it may have been written, but I just don't know. At that point, I have to confess agnosticism.
And what do you make of the realized eschatology in the Gospel of Thomas? And does it contain parallels in any way with the Synoptics, or is Thomas's eschatology a little bit different from that of the Synoptics?
So I think that Thomas is a second century text, and I think that it shows a development. Thomas is in some respects more like the Gospel of John, where the emphasis is on realized eschatology. Now, there is a bit of realized eschatology in the Synoptics. Again, I think I already referred to the saying in Luke, if I cast out demons by the finger of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. And there's also the sentence in Luke 17, the kingdom of God is in your midst, or the kingdom of God is among you. That seems that's probably also a statement about the present. But the Synoptics emphasize the future. There is this present note, but the emphasis is on what is yet to come. The early Christians, as time went by, I think moved the emphasis so that there was more focus on the present. And Thomas reflects this. Thomas reflects this change. There are a couple of places in Thomas where you can still see the old futuristic eschatology that's so prominent in Matthew and Mark. But I think that he is moving away from the eschatological Jesus towards a more realized eschatology. But I see the same thing in the Gospel of John. And I'm going to argue in a forthcoming book that you can see this sort of pattern also in other religious movements.
I'd like to go back to Mark for a second. And can you tell us a bit about the Aramaisms in Mark? Are there a lot of Aramaisms or just some Aramaisms? And if so, in either case, do you see an Aramaic source text behind the Aramaisms in Mark?
So I don't, but there was an important scholar, Maurice Casey, who died a little while ago, who translated much of Mark, or several of Mark's, a lot of Mark, back into Aramaic. And there are traces of Aramaic in Mark, and it's possible to translate some of Mark back into Aramaic without too much difficulty, although Casey is sometimes forced to say, well, Mark misunderstood the Aramaic and it must have said something else. When that happens, I get nervous. But the point is that if the tradition, Mark's tradition, goes back to early Jewish Christianity in part, it goes back in part to some of the followers of Jesus, and it has to if it has memories, then it's no surprise that there are Aramaic features. Now, how close Mark is to an Aramaic speaker, I have no idea. We have the old tradition that Mark heard Peter. This could be true. If it's true, however, I don't know. We don't know the details, how long he paid attention to Peter, or what other sources are behind his gospel. So one of the frustrating things about this business is that we frequently have to confess ignorance. So there are some Aramaic words in Mark, which is very interesting for a Greek text. They're not translated. Like Abba, it's not translated. It's just there. The words from the cross are translated, but the Aramaic is given. So this means the tradition itself is a tradition, and that as it moves into the Greek language, it's retaining some of the Aramaic features. But I can't tell you that it's because Mark was listening to Peter and Peter spoke in Aramaic and Mark was the translator. I can't even tell you, like Casey did, that this paragraph and that paragraph and this paragraph must be Aramaic. I don't think it's the translation as a whole of an Aramaic text. I think it's an originally Greek text. But again, there are signs here of tradition, and that's what the Aramaic words and Aramaic features are. They're signs of tradition.
Was apocalypticism or apocalyptic eschatology very popular in both Jesus' time and after his time?
Are you asking why? I missed the first one. You're asking why?
Sure. Yes.
Well, apocalyptic tends to come to the fore when people are unhappy, when people are miserable, and when things are not as they should be. And what's going on in Judaism in the first century before Christ, and in the century of Jesus, and then the following century, is that the country is occupied by the Romans. This was not fun, and this was a theological problem because God is the king of Israel, God is the king of the land, and it appears that many folks didn't think that this situation could go on much longer. And there was a great deal of hope that God would, in fact, intervene and drive the Romans out. In AD 70, that seems to be what's going on. In the 130s with the Bar Kokhba, the Second Great Revolt, that seems to be what's going on. And this is clearly what's going on in some of the apocalypses, like Fourth Ezra and like Second Baruch. And it's obviously what's going on in the book of Revelation, because the evil powers are manifested, the demonic powers are manifested in Babylon, which is transparently a symbol for Rome. So there is this Jewish religion, this Jewish ideology, and I think that it abets the proliferation of apocalyptic texts and encourages apocalyptic expectation.
Is there continuity between John the Baptist and Jesus?
Well, yes, I think so. There is an excursus, or I think it's called an excursus in this book on that. So one of the things that's very popular for scholars, some scholars to do, is to contrast Jesus and John. Jesus had a present eschatology. John was, only about the future. John baptized. Jesus didn't baptize. John the Baptist didn't do miracles. Jesus did miracles. I'm skeptical about this. First of all, this is the continuation of a motif that you find in the Gospels themselves. They are interested not only in paralleling Jesus and John, but drawing contrasts between them. But I think historically, if Jesus had himself baptized by John, then he must have agreed with much of what he said and did. And the Gospels do contain statements which praise John the Baptist, the greatest of those born among women. That must be hyperbole, but still, it's an incredible statement, given that you have, for example, Moses in your tradition. John the Baptist is greater than Moses. That's very strange. So I think Jesus's eschatology was probably in large part in line with that of John the Baptist. And Gospel of John actually says at one point, the Synoptics don't note this, it says that Jesus baptized for a little while. That may well be true. It's a really interesting note, and it's hard to figure out why John would have made this up. So while the tradition and many modern scholars like to contrast these two people, again, John was an ascetic, Jesus wasn't. I think some of these contrasts are simplistic. And then finally, I would also say that scholars know more about John the Baptist than I do. We only, at the very best, even if everything is totally accurate, we only have a few sentences about this guy. And you can't summarize anybody in a handful of sentences. We just have these little snippets about John the Baptist. So we don't know what he was saying as a whole. The tradition is interested in focusing on sayings that the Christians could connect to Jesus. Nobody was interested in a sort of dispassionate, here's the theology of John the Baptist. For all I know, he spoke about the Son of Man. There are all sorts of things we don't know about John the Baptist. So given, again, our ignorance, it's frustrating, but our ignorance, I'm much less inclined than many scholars to draw these neat contrasts between Jesus and John. I think there was probably a lot of continuity there.
Do you think that the early followers of John the Baptist and the early followers of Jesus were a united movement, or were they two different movements that were sort of intertwined in some ways and in some other ways not?
So I think John's gospel may be right, that some of Jesus's first followers, some of his first disciples actually came out of the Baptist movement. But we know from Acts and other sources that a Baptist movement continued. I think this is very clear from the Gospel of John, its statement in the prologue that John the Baptist was not the light of the world. That is a bizarre thing to say unless there are followers of John the Baptist who are making large claims for him. I'm a churchgoer. I've never heard anyone get up and say John the Baptist is not the light of the world. It's because nobody out there in the congregation has ever had the thought. You only say something like that if you are in some sort of religious competition with a Baptist sect. And there are other places in John's gospel where I think you can see that. And then, of course, there are some later sources which I think indicate movements that have some continuity with John the Baptist. So I'm guessing that Jesus and some of his disciples came out of the Baptist movement, and Jesus goes his own way. Maybe he didn't do that until John the Baptist was killed, but John still had disciples. There are disciples who bury him. And as I've just indicated, there is reason to think that not all of these people joined Jesus or became Christians. I think that there was, although everything's foggy and we don't have much data, there was a continuing movement of John the Baptist. I infer from the Gospel of John that, at least in some places, they were competitors to the early Christians. So, I see a sort of split, and then two groups going in different ways, one eventually being far more successful than the other.
And what do we know about the sayings of the kingdom and the world to come? What were they talking about when they were saying when they were bringing those kind of things up in the Gospels?
You're asking about the phrase kingdom of God. So in the Gospels, kingdom of God is shorthand for the future world that God is about to bring. If you compare what the Gospels say about the kingdom of God with what the rabbis say about the world to come, there is a lot of overlap. It's really, really interesting. So I think the kingdom of God is, first of all, primarily something like heaven on earth, or the Messianic kingdom, or the world as God intends it to be. And this world is not something that is brought by human beings gradually getting better and governments instituting social programs and so on. This is a miraculous, otherworldly state that is a miracle and comes at the end of time. So that's what kingdom means, first of all. Now, there are some places in the Gospels, I think, where kingdom also means the people who will be in that kingdom. But going back to the question you opened with, for me, this is, first of all, an eschatological term. It refers to the rule of God, which is not yet fully established on earth, but will soon be.
All right, I'm going to take some questions from the audience. Scroll up for a second. I'll take Arnold's question first. He says, Dr. Allison, do you wonder that the kingdom of God among you is God's relating with us, and that in the work of Christ, the ball's in our court?
The kingdom of God among you. My own guess about this, it's difficult to say for sure, but I think I like Origen's view of this. So his view, in effect, is that the presence of Jesus is the beginning of the presence of the kingdom. So the kingdom among you is Jesus being among you. So this would be being there with Jesus during the ministry and the unfolding of eschatological time. But later Christian sources do internalize that, and I'm a wannabe mystic, and I have no trouble at all with then understanding this saying or transforming it into the kingdom of God is within you as a possibility. And that can be in the present interpreted Christologically also. So I see a little difference there between what the saying originally meant in the ministry of Jesus and the way it's developed later on, which I like.
Why call Jesus an aphorist?
Why call Jesus an aphorist?
Mm-hmm.
Well, because he uttered some remarkable one-liners. An aphorist is somebody who can utter a sentence that really gets your attention and then just says a lot with a few words and makes you to think. And Jesus, whatever else Jesus was, he's a really clever fellow. And there are all sorts of sentences that are attributed to him that show us that he was great at one-liners, right? So the first will be last and the last first. That's a really interesting sentence, and it's clever and it's memorable. You hear it once or twice and you remember it. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. That's a really interesting sentence. I think you only need to hear it once to remember it. And it's very provocative. And what exactly does it mean? Anyway, the Gospels are full of these sorts of one-liners, sometimes paradoxical. And I don't think Jesus just went around randomly sort of speaking aphorisms. That is, he would come to a crowd, utter one sentence, and go on. I think these aphorisms are always within the context of a larger speech. But it is really interesting that if you look at quite a number of passages in the Synoptic Gospels, there's this short introduction, then Jesus says something, and then that's the end. The story has been created just for this one-liner. And of course, all sorts of things were going on historically, that aren't in the text, but people remember the one-liner, and so they make it the center of this little passage. There are quite a few of those in the Gospels.
Jay Gary asks, Dr. Allison, how did Paul view Jesus as apocalyptic? Or I think you might say apocalypticism.
Yeah, okay. So if you look at Paul in First Thessalonians hopes that the end is near. And this is a hope that he never gives up. He still has this in Romans, and still has it in Philippians, although he thinks he may die before Jesus comes. So the way the question is formulated, I'm not exactly sure how to answer it, but I would say this, that if Jesus has a lot of eschatology in his message, Paul has a lot of eschatology in his message. And if Jesus is hoping for the realization of prophecies, Paul is hoping for the realization of prophecies. And if Jesus is speaking about the Son of Man, Paul is thinking about the coming on the clouds of heaven. So there are these very strong lines of continuity. But I would also say, going back to what I said earlier, that while eschatology is very important to Paul, it's not the only thing going on in Paul. And again, that fits what I said with Jesus. I think Jesus is kind of like the Gospel of Matthew. Eschatology is important, is really important, but it's not the only thing going on. So I see a lot of continuity between Paul and Jesus. Now, one more thing to add, there has been this really interesting debate for the last 2 centuries as to how much Paul knew about Jesus. The letters, the extant letters, don't quote Jesus very often, and they don't offer large summaries of his ministry. They don't say he was an exorcist, for example. But I think if you do a careful analysis, you can infer that Paul probably knew a lot of the traditions about Jesus. And so I think myself that when Paul is being eschatological or apocalyptic in his own mind, he is being like Jesus because he knows the traditions of the sayings of Jesus.
To a question from Lalo. Dr. Allison, can much be said about whether the apocalypticism in the New Testament is representative of Judean movements as a whole? Or is it just a rural Galilean flavor, Jesus / John the Baptist?
No, I think this is more than Galilee. So we do not have much from Galilee. I don't know. Maybe one text, maybe the Testament of Moses, which is apocalyptic, could come from Galilee. But most of our apocalyptic texts we can't tie to Galilee, and the revolts in 70 and in the 130s are not just Galilean revolts. So the answer is no. This is a wider Jewish phenomenon. If you look at the book of Daniel, for example, it's very apocalyptic. It's 2nd century BCE, and it's not a Galilean text. Where it comes from exactly, we don't know. But I would say that the apocalyptic or eschatological, I don't know if fervor is the right word. We don't have we didn't have opinion polls back then. All we have are some texts that we hope are roughly representative. But we do know from Josephus that lots and lots of Jews hoped that God would come and drive the Romans out. And much of that hope must have been fueled by eschatological expectations. So this is a Jewish-wide movement. It's not just a Galilean thing.
Lalo, thank you for your super chat. See if I can find another question here. We are. X Music says, is the Son of Man is the Son of Man of a divine is the Son of Man a divine designation? It had many meanings before the Gospels.
Oh my, well, this is a huge discussion. So we do know that an Aramaic expression or different forms of it were used sort of like a pronoun, like or like the English one must do one's duty, for example, or just referring to a person, sort of like in the book of Ezekiel, Son of Man there in Hebrew, and it means he is immortal. So there's that linguistic tradition. But in the book of Daniel, the one like a son of man, who is like a human, that's what the word means, becomes something more. And I haven't figured all of this out, but the scene there looks sort of like the old Canaanite myth, where the old god comes and goes away, and the new god comes, the old man on the throne, and then a replacement. Depends on what you mean by divine also, which continues to be a big debate that I don't completely understand. But I will say that the figure in Daniel is an exalted figure, and occasionally a modern scholar will conjecture, well, maybe this was in the mind of the author, the Archangel Michael. Whether that's true or not, this is a heavenly figure, and this is a figure that rules. And if you want to call that figure divine, then I don't have any objection to that. So there are a couple of trajectories here. That is, there's a one linguistic tradition where this just means, a human being or one. But there's the other trajectory, which comes out of Daniel 7. You could also see it in the parables of Enoch, which I think is probably contemporary with Jesus. You can also see it in Fourth Ezra. I think you'd see it in Paul. And by the way, the figure of the Son of Man from Daniel 7 in Enoch is a divine figure. He is very exalted and conducts the judgment and other things that we associate with God. So how much of this is known to Jesus, how much is known to his disciples originally, is hard to tell. Again, I will go back to the fact that we just have some sources. And most of the books that were circulating back then are certainly gone, have disappeared. We have tons of little pieces from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and nobody can figure out what books they came from. They don't fit anything we know. So you have to be careful. But I think there is a tradition that informs Jesus, which is not just Daniel 7, that this glorious figure in Daniel 7 is divine, semi-divine, heavenly figure, and so on. It's an exalted figure. And so to identify yourself with that is to make a large claim.
Is our best access to the teachings of Jesus in the parallels between Q and Thomas?
Oh, so I'm not a Thomas person. So the answer to that for me is no. I think Thomas shows signs of knowing the Synoptics. I think there are many places where it's secondary. I think its eschatology is almost consistently secondary. There are places where it may contain early tradition or independent tradition, but I'm more skeptical of that than I used to be. So I'm not one to look at Q and Thomas, put them side by side, and say, okay, that's the best way to get back to Jesus. My own view is to put Matthew, Mark, and Luke together and to say, what are the common themes, motifs? What are the things that keep repeating in these sources? For me, Thomas is a very secondary text, much more than it used to be.
And in my closing question, how does one tell between like how much of the story is invented myth and how much of it is not?
Well, that's a really big question. So I don't know really how to give a clear answer to that. If I had a clear answer, I probably wouldn't have spent my career trying to answer that question. Again, there are stories in the Gospels that I look at, and I think that's probably a legend. But I'm not trying to approach Jesus now by evaluating this story or this saying or that saying. What I'm doing is I'm looking at repeating themes and motifs and then trying to construct an historical argument that theme or that motif or that rhetorical device goes back to Jesus. So, for example, there are parables, lots of them in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I think if Jesus didn't speak in parables, the sources are terrible. They're not remembering at all, and we just need to give up and go home. But I think you can construct arguments for the view that Jesus spoke in parables. And then I think you can look at the parables as a group and draw certain inferences from them. So, do I think there are some legends in the Gospels? Yes. Do I trust all the details? No. Do I think things grew in the telling? Yes. But I also think that there is a lot of memory in these texts. I think there are things in these texts that Christians almost certainly didn't make up, like people thought Jesus was possessed by a demon, or that he was a glutton and a drunkard, or that he was baptized by John the Baptist, or his family didn't believe in him. There are enough things like that in these texts that I'm inclined to say, no, there's a lot of memory here, and there's enough that we can construct, as I try to do in this book, the historical Jesus.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dale Allison.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you for coming on. I just want to remind everybody, do get his book, Constructing Jesus. The History Valley Amazon affiliate link will be in the description below, so go check it out and go get it. Thanks again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.